Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Hojiwana and today I'm exploring Sci-Fi's obsession with melee weapons, going over some of the common tropes and examining why they get used so much. If you're a long-term viewer, we did a similar thing for guns already, so you know what to expect. We're going to start with the weapons that make the most sense, items that are tools that just happen to be used as melee weapons out of convenience in a particular situation. Knives, crowbars, axes, things of that nature. It's hard or impossible to say these don't make any sense because of their situational nature, though Starfield sure tries its best by giving many generic raider enemies fire axes as their primary weapon. Speaking of axes, their use in real life as breaching tools, particularly by firefighters, gives them an edge over many of these other tools in use on spacecraft, especially when combined with crowbars. Legend of Galactic Heroes makes particular use of axe-wielding, power armor-equipped boarding crews for exactly this reason, and because of the space fantasy armored knights vibe it wants to project. And the general vibe of a setting is one of the major reasons why melee weapons might show up. Take the sword duel in Firefly for example. Everything about that episode was centered around recreating a very specific historical feeling. Sure, the swords may not see widespread use outside of that circumstance, but they are there. They add to the world building of that part of society. There's also a lot of bleed over with fantasy here, but I'll talk about that later on. Getting back to weapons, there are those that are all weirdly shaped and probably impractical. Those ones used by an alien culture so it has to be different, or is a future version of an existing weapon that got spiced up for its own sake. One of the more obvious things here is the Klingon Bat'leth, which is the absolute poster boy for this with its odd shape. Gunblades are an offshoot of the weird impractical weapons, combining melee weapons with a ranged one, typically in such a fashion as to render both significantly worse. To be clear here, I don't mean bayonets, which essentially convert a long rifle into a spear without really changing how it functioned as a rifle. I mean things that smush a gun into a melee weapon in a strange way, like D'Argo's Qualter Blade, which is a powerful rifle, but to use it like that you have to hold it by the blade, which isn't the best. Speaking of blades, it is exceedingly common for Sci-Fi to justify melee weapons still being around by giving them some technological aspect that makes them far more effective than they otherwise would be. Stuff like monomolecular edges, incorporating nanotech or vibroblades. In a similar vein are chainswords, or weapons with things like thermal edges or powered up with electricity. Sometimes these just add a minor extra effect like stun weapons, or they go full on with the elemental effect going everywhere and conveniently never having any impact on the user. Frankly, if you're hitting people with a weapon like these, then the extra effect probably isn't going to do much, though in super gamified systems like Cyberpunk or Warframe or Destiny, then realism is hardly a concern. The next step up from these is to go to full-blown energy weapons. After all, it's hard to get more sci-fi-y than taking a standard weapon and turning it into a glowing, transparent thing, right? You got your plasma swords, you got your other kind of plasma swords, you got your other kind of plasma swords, and you got your other kind of plasma swords. And naturally, they all have dubious methods of containing the plasma they use, if they even bother with that at all. It's easy to see why these are used so much, as they are supremely cool, and can do extra special stuff like cutting through almost anything, but they have many issues that have been talked about to death over the years. Battery life, lacking weight, which is both a plus and a minus, and the eternally blurst just turn them off and on in a duel thing. Something I see brought up less often though is that energy blades that can cut through anything because they are hot are, well, really hot. Infrared radiation from a blade that can cut through metal like that would burn a user without touching them, so they're not cool weapons at all. Okay, that joke was terrible, but I will not apologise. And with lightsabers, we get to the core of where I think melee weapons really cemented themselves into the foundations of the genre. Science, fantasy, or even just sci-fi that took heavy inspiration from mythology or history before the widespread adoption of firearms. Star Wars, for example, a setting with wizards and witches and knights and ghosts. Melee weapons being here just makes sense. Speaking of Star Wars, how good was Diana Lee Inosanto's choreography in that last episode of Ahsoka? In fact, all the duels were pretty decent on a narrative level, with everyone having their own unique fighting style that fit their character. The camera wasn't cutting every picosecond to cover up imperfect choreography either. An active choice was made to clearly show the story of the fight instead. Yeah, the timing of the performers could have been better, but the style of it, the characterization and everything like that came through really strongly, which I feel is more important in in Star Wars anyway. Another sci-fi staple that is heavy on melee combat is Dune, which has ample world building around why swords and knives are so heavily preferred. Shields slow down any high-speed object, so guns simply wouldn't work, and lasers cause other issues. Which is all very interesting, but really it's because melee combat is so much more personal, so much more intimate compared to a gunfight. Don't get me wrong, you can make a gunfight between two people who have similar intensity and tension, but they're going to lack a lot of the back and forth that melee combat has. Some media has tried to get a similar vibe going on by combining the two, like Gunkata in Equilibrium, which ended up looking faintly ridiculous, and whatever this insanity is in Resident Evil Vendetta. Throughout all these examples, the sword stands out above all the others for how much it's been used. Star Wars obviously has a lot of them, but they're everywhere. Even the Klingons and the stereotypes around them and their little daggers and the bat'leth do actually have proper sword and machete style weapons in use. But why are they so popular? Simply put, swords are just practical weapons. That's why they've been used throughout all of history. They're just a big blade that can be carried easily. It's also relatively easy to sci-fi them up with some techie words, or magic, if you really feel the need, as we talked about earlier. But there's one specific type of sword that has reached such legendary levels of cool by itself that it stands out as being its own thing in regards to sci-fi. This is of course the katana. Well, really there's a bunch of varieties and many of the ones in sci-fi shouldn't count at all, but the word katana is so ingrained in people's minds that everything ends up coming under that umbrella. Even The Expanse can't get away from it, as the Rocinante started out as the tachi, which is the style of sword that the katana was derived from. They're so integral to the pop culture zeitgeist that I can't really say where they come from or why they show up so much. Obviously, they look cool, and there's the enduring image of the ninja, but beyond that, I have no idea. They're just there, even in settings that otherwise avoided dedicated melee weapons like Mass Effect, where the third game introduced them and had Kaileng and Phantoms using them. This kind of blends into another big reason for why melee weapons in sci-fi are so common that I alluded to earlier. There's just an expectation that a show or movie or game will have them because previous bits of media that are similar had melee weapons in a bit of a feedback loop. This even goes down to specific types of weapons being used, like katanas, or not used, like spears. Those saw widespread historical use but don't show up in sci-fi that often, which I think really is just down to them still feeling low-tech. Something like swords are already part of the genre, so people expect them in media they see or create, propagating their usage further. Spears never got that, so they don't appear as often, but it does feel somewhat special when they do show up, like the Beskar one in The Mandalorian. To wrap up, while melee weapons may not necessarily make a lot of sense, sometimes they do. They get included for lots of reasons, from wanting to create a specific vibe to the trappings of the genre, but are also exceedingly good at creating characterful moments between opposing forces.
What does katana mean?
You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our Space Fighter design reference book. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by giving us super thanks or by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.